Hello, and welcome to the Science Bloggers Podcast, the show where we talk to science bloggers, YouTubers, and podcasters about science and science communication. I'm your host, David Latchman. This is our second episode, and joining me today is Chris Cloney. Chris does research in dust explosions, and I asked him about what he does, the science behind a particularly explosive scene in the 2018 movie The Equalizer 2, and ideas for running your science communication as a business. So, hi Chris, how are you?
Very good, David. I'm very excited to be here today.
Excited to have you as well. So, why don't you tell our listeners, a little something about yourself and the research that you do?
Sure. So I just finished my PhD in chemical engineering in Canada. My specific department is process engineering. So that's a sort of a branch of chemical engineering. We deal with design of systems around processing materials. So it could be cars, it could be the laptops in front of you, it could be the microphones you're talking into. What do the factories and plants look like to actually build these sort of industrial equipment and materials that we're using every day? My specific branch under that is the safety involved with creating those processes, and in particular the fire and explosion hazards that come up when you're dealing with these massive amounts of materials. So that MacBook Air that you have on your desk in front of you is nice, polished, and has the shiny surface on it. When they polish that aluminum, they actually make a fair bit of aluminum dust, which is quite flammable, and ends up being can be an explosion hazard in some of these processing operations. So my field then is specifically dealing with these sort of combustible dusts that are generated during engineering processing.
Oh, I see. Because when I was looking at your blog, right, and you think dust explosion, right? And it sort of makes sense, right? So a dust, it has this large surface area. So if it gets on fire, there's that large surface area to act on. And I sort of assumed that, okay, it's just going to be like these carbon-rich compounds, right? So like flour or something, or starch. But, as you just said with aluminium, right, it's a metal, right? So it turns out, if I'm getting this right, it's also certain reactive metals that can explode. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Anything that's not, basically anything that's not a rock, limestone or came to the earth that way, anything that's has a fuel component can burn. And if you make surface area ratio small enough, can burn very rapidly. And then if you disperse that into the air while it's burning, you can get an explosion.
I see. So again, when I was looking at your site, right, you have like certain like fire triangles and fire squares or flash squares, if I'm remembering it correctly. And you have another one that's a pentagon. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. So that's sort of the entry point that we use a lot of the time when we're talking to the, I'd say general public, but normally it would be workers that are handling these materials. Right. Not necessarily somebody at home with baby powder or flour, but somebody in a processing mill that's creating that material. So we use these kind of geometric shapes just as a way to simplify it. So the fire triangle says that in order to have a fire, you need a fuel, you need an oxidizing source, usually oxygen and air, might be something else in exotic operation, and you need an ignition source. So if you remove any one of those three things, you can avoid having a fire.
Right.
So that's the fire triangle. And then it's called the deflagration square or flame propagation square. If you actually disperse that fuel into the air, so now it's no longer sitting on the ground, but it's dispersed in the air, that flame will propagate as an open flash fire. And that flash fire is essentially a giant fireball. And then if you add confinement, so that's the fifth side, so that makes your pentagon. So if you take that flash fire, that fireball, and confine it in a piece of processing equipment, you'll get a pressure rise. And that pressure rise can lead to destructive forces, which is the kind of trigger for if you think of an explosion as a rupturing process vessel, that's kind of the fifth side of the explosion pentagon. So we sort of use that geometric shape. I've obviously used it as my logo and stuff on my website, but we use it as a general way to start to communicate some of the hazards. If you want to reduce the hazard or prevent it, you can remove any one of those five sides. You can get rid of the fuel. You could inert under nitrogen, so get rid of the oxidizer. You can remove your ignition sources, obviously. You can stop the dust from getting dispersed. So maybe you change your processing operation from dumping it in a big bag into a hopper or a bin, into maybe a conveyor where it's not dispersed. Or you can actually remove the confinement, and then you can stop the explosion from happening. So that may happen from, you can put vent panels on the side of your processing operation, removes confinement at a set trigger pressure, and that will reduce the overall effect of the explosion on your processing vessel.
Oh, I see. That's interesting that, you can just remove one component, like, okay, going beyond those shapes beyond the fire triangle, you can just remove like one component, and you can prevent an explosion. That's fascinating. I do kind of like have one question, right? It takes place in a movie. It's a recent movie. So it's the Equalizer 2. So it stars Denzel Washington. So for context, it's sort of like this American movie. It's a reboot of an old American TV series, and so he goes around. He's this like ex-military guy, and so in the third act, right, he's taking on these bad guys in this abandoned town, and he goes into a room that looks like it was like the kitchen of a bakery, of a large bakery. And he slashes these large bags of flour. So flour is like falling onto the floor, and then he turns on these big fans, and so it's whipping around like particles of flour into the air. And initially you think it's like, okay, well, these bad guys, they're checking these rooms. This is just going to be a distraction for him to take these guys down. But it turns out like one of these guys, he's throwing flashbang grenades into the room. And when he does that, it goes boom, and it kills him. So, I know you probably haven't seen the movie, but do you want to talk about the science behind that scene? Or if it's possible to something like that to happen?
It's definitely possible. I mean, my whole blog and research is on preventing that from happening. Not necessarily in a military scene, but in a in a flour mill. So there's a couple things that you can tell in some of these movies. Maybe we won't go down the fire dynamics track, but the scale is an issue. So if you have a small fire, it doesn't look like a big fire. The Reynolds number is different. That's sort of a different thing. With combustible dust, the minimum explosible concentration. So the minimum concentration need to actually explode, typically between 20 and 100 grams per meter cubed, depending on the dust. And the reason that's important is that is where the limit is that the cloud becomes optically thick. So what that means in normal terms is you can't see through it. So if you just see these little dust particles dancing around like you would at your home, you have dust bunnies or whatever collecting, and they go through the air. If you can see through that cloud, it's not at 30 grams per meter cubed. It's not at a range where you can actually have a flame self-propagate through it. So that scene, if you can see through the flour cloud, then it's below the limit where it could propagate a flame. If you get to the point where you can't see through that cloud any longer, then it's actually could be above the limit of self-propagating a flame through that medium. So then that's the way to kind of tell. If you stop being able to see through the cloud, it's dangerous, which is actually a good thing for us in process safety, because you don't typically have workers working in areas where you can't see through the dust in the air. You can under upset conditions, and that's not good because they're breathing that. But normally these explosions, at least the primary ones, are occurring inside process vessels that are enclosed. So you can see that you can't see through that cloud if you were to look into it. And then there's secondary explosions and other things that can come into play. That'd be the first kind of check in that scene is, can you actually see through that cloud? Is it optically thick or optically thin means you can see through it, optically thick means you can't. And that would tell you whether or not you're in explosible range. So if you're in that range, then the question is, what's the energy released by a flashbang grenade? Most dusts typically have minimum ignition energies around, well, it really depends, but we'll say around tens to hundreds of millijoules. I would suggest that a flashbang grenade probably has enough energy to ignite that. It probably has more than that amount. So that could be a what we call a viable ignition source. And then the rest is all there as well. You have your fuel, your oxidizer. So you'd end up with either the square that we talked about, so a fireball, or if that fireball was in an enclosed room, you could end up with the actual room blowing apart from a pressure rise and explosion.
Wow, fascinating. So for anyone listening, don't try this at home. This is just a science discussion.
That's right.
So you're also, the admin for your own science communication group. Do you want to talk about that one?
Sure. Yeah. So I started my blog about 2 years ago now, and I just finished my PhD in April, so 3 months ago or so, from the time that we're recording now, and I grew the blog into a business. I launched DustX Research, which is a worldwide research company focusing on tackling some of the higher level issues that we see in our industry. And that's really my full-time business at the moment. So I took from just blogging about my research through to monetizing in different ways to launching my corporation once I actually graduated again, which is only in April. But that month that I graduated, I defended my thesis on Monday. Just how the incorporation documents came in, my business actually was formed on Tuesday. It takes a few weeks for the lawyers to do, but just came in on a Tuesday, the day after my defense. Yes. And then I went to Chicago the following Monday and sort of launched my business at an industry conference there.
Oh, that's great. So So some of the discussions that we have on the Facebook groups is sort of like finding your place in this science communication landscape, right? And one of the things that you had said before was trying to figure out whether you're like a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond, right? Because that's going to affect how you market yourself, how you get that word out. So do you want to explain some of that to the listeners?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. So right before I actually started my blog, I was trying to find a way to start building my own business. And I tried a couple different things and none of them were very good. I tried a local gluten-free delivery service that never got off the ground. I tried a ticket swapping service with the local arena here, and none of that really worked. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and said, well, what can I do to start learning? I started paying attention to the online marketing space. So why don't I just write about and start building a business about what I do every day, which is read these scientific academic papers. So I was just writing literally every day. I'd read a paper, jot down notes on the back, write a blog post about it. But what I sort of learned is, if you go Google online marketing or how to build the business online, the first thing they say is we need to find a really small niche that only a few people care about, but the people that care about it a lot. And I realized pretty quickly that's every person's PhD or master's degree. There's 100 people in the world that care about my thesis. Actually, there's probably 5 people in the world that care about my thesis. 100 people in the world that care about my research area, and maybe 1,000 that it ends up impacting. So it's very narrow kind of niche. So I think everyone that is doing these sort of advanced degrees could actually start blogging about the research and just get that small niche impact down. So the thing that's important there is I'm really the first person to communicate online in the world of combustible dust, in the world of dust explosions and explosions as industrial safety, because it was such a niche topic. But because I was the first one to do it, as a solo person, it really opened up a lot of opportunity. So if I had to change my mind and started blogging about, being a lifestyle blogger or, I don't know, working out or some really, really competitive niche, then it becomes quite hard. You're a small fish in a big pond. But if you start blogging about your academic research, chances are you're going to be the biggest fish out there talking about that specific topic. If you're not, you can actually go down even deeper. And if you get to the point of actually blogging about your thesis research, chances are there's only a couple people in the world that are talking about that. So it gives you an opportunity to then have the biggest chunk of that kind of awareness about that topic. So does that answer your thought?
Well, yeah. What it does is that it establishes you as an authority. And I believe as far as dust explosion research, you're sort of like that, right?
Yeah, wasn't expecting it, but it's weird. I was just at a conference last week in Kansas City, in Missouri. And, you do your normal conference thing and you go shake somebody's hand and say, hey, I'm Chris Cloney. I do. And then now I get this kind of look in their eye because I have 1,200 people on my newsletter that goes out every week. And they sort of go, do I know you? Or, oh, I follow your newsletter. And the newsletter's been going over 2 years now. It's very kind of strange because I've been going to academic conferences for 7-8 years now. But now when I go, people start to recognize who you are. And that just really helps build your brand. It helps with if you're trying to find employment after graduating, if you want to build your own business. There's so many advantages that I can't even stress it enough. And that's a little why I started the Academic Blogging Network as a Facebook group, and just to help people start to do that, because I was seeing the power pretty early on in my own career before I even realized I could build a business out of it. And it really does start to establish yourself as a brand in your space. And you can use that in many different ways. It could be building a business, or it could just be to get your academic research out there more. Now, if I want my thesis, I could, I can and probably will put that out to my newsletter community, which has 1,200 people. I'll get 300 downloads of it. If I wasn't doing this, 5 people may see my thesis ever.
Right. So, I think, it's an interesting way to look at it. And it's sort of like borrows on an idea in publishing, like what a horizontal or what a vertical is, right? So for those that don't know, so magazines tend to get, it can be broad, catered to a large audience, or they can get like really specific. So you have running magazines, right? So you have like the casual runner, people who compete in marathons, and you can get really specific. So you can get like magazines for people who run the 100-meter dash, and those tend to be trade publications. So
right.
It sounds like that's sort of like what your blog is, your mailing letter. It's closer to a trade issue, isn't it?
Sure, and you can always. It's a lot easier to generalize, to start really niche and move back, than it is to start really broad and move in. So that's kind of the important part that I didn't realize when I started, but that's the big fish in a small pond. I just got lucky and went really narrow, and I actually had to back off a bit because there's only so many researchers in the world that care about what I was doing. So I started translating that into what does it mean about industry? What does that mean about government regulations? And kind of generalizing my work back farther out. But I started very, very niche, but it starts to bring more people in. But if you start really general, the magazine for all runners of all shapes and sizes, of all athletic abilities, then it's very hard to start drilling back down and build a niche out of a general audience.
That's true. It's an interesting way to look at it, and I think it helps people to think about it along those lines. Like how they're going to get to people and reach out to them, and hopefully be successful.
Sure.
Yeah. So, is there anything else you'd like to talk about or tell our listeners?
Not Well, maybe a couple things. This was an interesting interview because I didn't know what to expect coming in. If it was going to be on science, if it was going to be on science communication, if it's going to be on business. So it's really interesting to see where we went. And I think it's going to help a lot of people. One thing I would say that I see a lot in the space is people start with the first thing is you need to know your audience. And people start with thinking that researcher, I call it R2B, research to public is the only way to go. And it is an important way. And there's people that are doing that with vaccination, people that are doing that with global warming. Like that's what a lot of people think is they start with science communication is I need to talk to the public. And that is an important audience. But there's other ways that you can blog about your research. You can do R2R, so researcher to researcher, how-tos on certain technologies, how to do experimental techniques, and you can also do researcher to business, R2B. So, and that's where I ended up. I started with R2R and moved towards R2B. Now I do a lot of blogging for industry, and it actually gives me a place where I can start to bring researchers, the public, and industry together. But I guess that's the point I kind of want to leave on is that there is a ability here to reach out just beyond not just the general public, although that's a really important role, but there's other audiences you can target and then bring those back in.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very diverse field, and at least from interacting with the group, that's one of the things I've discovered. As you said, we tend to think of science communication as only research to public, and I guess there are some people who will defend that to the death.
Sure.
That's the only way to do it.
And that's needed, but it's not the only way in my opinion.
And I agree with you. It's not the only thing. There are a lot of ways to communicate. No one way is the best. We need them all, and they're all on that equal importance, so to speak.
Certainly. Yeah,
so,
there's a lot of jobs that need done.
Yes, there is. And, hopefully we can help people, both in your group and mine, help people figure that out and, learn the best way to get to that goal.
Certainly.
Yes. So anything else you'd like to say before we conclude?
No, that's really it. If people want to find out what I'm doing more, they can check out my science blog, dustsafetyscience.com. If you're not that interested in fire and explosion protection industry, which I anticipate most of the viewers of this podcast may not be so much, you can check me out in the academic Facebook or the Academic Blogging Network Facebook group, or the new website, grabblogger.com, where we're really trying to help other PhDs and master students start blogging about their research and change the industries that they're working in.
Okay, I'll be sure to put links in the show notes.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you for talking with me.
All right, thanks, David. I really appreciate it, and it's really interesting to talk with the community further.
Okay, yes it is. And have a good day.
Thanks, David.
That was Chris Cloney. If you would like to learn more about the safety and the science behind dust explosions, be sure to check out his blog, mydustexplosion.com. And if you're a scientist interested in getting your research out to a wider audience, you can join Chris's Facebook group. Links are provided in the show notes. The Science Bloggers is a community of science communicators. If you're a science blogger, YouTuber, or podcaster, feel free to check out our Facebook group. And if you're interested in science content, you can also stop by our Facebook page. I am David Latchman, and I would like to thank you for listening. This was our second episode, and we have released 3 episodes of our podcast on our first day. So stay tuned for our third episode, where we talk to Anastasia Botner and a project, SciMoms. SciMoms, or Science Moms, is a science blog and a group of science communicators who bring evidence-based science to parenting.